When a rude customer humiliates Diane for her southern accent, an unexpected hero emerges in the most surprising way. What will happen when a single act of kindness turns her life around? Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more stories that inspire and uplift. The diner hummed with life, its tables packed with regulars and newcomers seeking a quick bite in the heart of Los Angeles. The scent of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee mingled with the clatter of silverware against ceramic plates. Diane Matthews darted from table to table, balancing a tray of steaming dishes with the finesse of someone who had mastered the chaotic rhythm of the lunchtime rush. "Here you go, ma'am. 2 pancakes with extra syrup and a side of bacon," Diane said, placing the plate in front of an elderly woman at table 6. Her warm southern accent turned heads, and she caught a few smiles from nearby diners. It wasn't the kind of accent often heard in this part of the city, and while some found it charming, others, well, not so much. Diane's accent wasn't the only thing that set her apart. Her glowing dark skin and confident stride were matched by a kindness that radiated through every interaction. She'd moved to Los Angeles from Jackson, Mississippi, with a suitcase full of hopes and a dream to one day open her own bakery. For now, this diner job was her stepping stone. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and kept her inching closer to saving enough for her first big move. Diane. "Table 4's asking for their check," barked Maria, the manager, from behind the counter. On it, Diane replied, grabbing the receipt pad from her apron and weaving through the crowd. Her curls bounced with each step, the exhaustion barely visible behind her ever-present smile. As she approached table 4, Diane slowed. There sat Mr. Brooks, a well-dressed man in his early 40s with a sharp jawline and an even sharper tongue. A regular at the diner, Brooks was known for his impeccable taste in food and his equally poor taste in how he treated people. "You took your sweet time, didn't you?" Brooks sneered, his voice loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Diane's smile faltered for just a moment before she steadied herself. "I'm sorry for the wait, Mr. Brooks. Here's your check," she said, placing the slip on the table with practiced calm. Brooks picked it up with an exaggerated motion and squinted at the total. I don't understand why they hire people who can barely speak proper English," he said, glaring at Diane. "This is Los Angeles, not some backwoods hick town." The nearby chatter died down, replaced by awkward silence as heads turned toward their table. Diane's chest tightened, but she swallowed the lump forming in her throat. "I'm sorry if my service didn't meet your expectations," she said softly, her accent thickening slightly as her emotions surged. "You're right, it didn't. And neither does that ridiculous drawl," Brooks shot back. "You sound like a cartoon character. Honestly, who even talks like that anymore?" Diane felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She glanced around, noticing the other diners avoiding eye contact, their gazes fixed on their plates. No one intervened, though a few looked uncomfortable. Even Maria stayed behind the counter, busying herself with the register. "Mr. Brooks, I'm here to serve you." "Not to be ridiculed," Diane said, her voice steady despite the sting of his words. "Oh, I see. So you're the victim now," he said, leaning back in his chair with a smug grin. "Typical." Diane's heart pounded in her chest, her hands gripping her tray tightly. She wanted to say more, to defend herself, but her professionalism held her back. The last thing she needed was to lose this job. From the corner of her eye, Diane noticed a man in a hoodie sitting alone in a booth near the back of the diner. He'd been there for a while, eating slowly and watching the scene unfold. He lowered his coffee cup, his face obscured by the shadows of his hood. Something about his calm demeanor caught Diane's attention, but she quickly looked away, focusing instead on regaining her composure. "Anything else I can get for you, Mr. Brooks?" Diane asked, her voice calm despite the tremble in her hands. Brooks waved her off dismissively. "Just get out of my face." As Diane turned to leave, she noticed the man in the hoodie adjust his seat, his movements deliberate. Though she didn't know it yet, her day and her life was about to take a turn she never could have imagined. The din of the restaurant returned as Diane walked back toward the counter, her shoulders heavy with the weight of the interaction. She couldn't let the incident shake her, not now, not ever. Diane had dealt with her fair share of rude customers, but something about Mr. Brooks's cutting remarks stung more than usual. They lingered, echoing in her mind as she reached for the coffee pot to refill table three's cups. "Hey, are you okay?" one of her coworkers, Elena, whispered as she passed by. Diane offered a small, tight-lipped smile. "I'm fine," she lied, focusing on the steam rising from the coffee. Her heart was still racing, her hands trembling slightly as she poured. As she moved to deliver the coffee, she noticed Brooks hadn't left. Instead, he was sitting back in his chair, his voice cutting through the chatter of the diner. He was talking loudly, clearly wanting everyone to hear. "I mean, really, it's like they're hiring anyone off the street these days," he said, laughing as he leaned toward a man sitting at the next table. "What's next? Someone who doesn't even speak English." The man he addressed looked deeply uncomfortable, his face turning red as he avoided Brooks's gaze. Diane tightened her grip on the tray, determined to ignore him, but the weight of his words hung in the air, heavier with every second. Maria, the manager, finally noticed the growing tension. She stepped out from behind the counter, smoothing her apron nervously. "Mr. Brooks, is there a problem?" she asked, her voice light but firm. Brooks gave her a dismissive wave. "No problem at all. I was just making an observation about your staff. You might want to think about hiring people who can represent this place a little better," he said, glancing pointedly at Diane. Maria hesitated, her eyes flickering between Brooks and Diane. It was clear she didn't want to upset either of them, especially not Brooks, a regular customer who tipped well, even if he was obnoxious. Diane couldn't take it anymore. She stepped forward, holding her chin high. "With all due respect, Mr. Brooks, I do my job with integrity, and I treat everyone with respect. I'd appreciate the same in return." The diner grew silent again, the tension thick and tangible. Brooks smirked, clearly enjoying the attention. "Oh, look at that. Someone's got a little backbone. I guess they teach you that back in the sticks, huh?" Diane felt her stomach drop, but before she could respond, a new voice cut through the silence. "That's enough." The voice was calm but carried a weight that demanded attention. Heads turned toward the booth in the back, where the man in the hoodie now stood. He lowered his hood, revealing a familiar face, sharp cheekbones, signature braids, and a laid-back confidence that immediately drew every eye in the room. It was Snoop Dogg. The silence was almost deafening. A few diners whispered to each other in disbelief, while others pulled out their phones to record the unfolding drama. Diane froze, her mind racing as she tried to process what was happening. Snoop took a slow step forward, his movements measured but commanding. He glanced at Diane, offering her a small, reassuring nod before turning his full attention to Brooks. "Man, I don't know who you think you are," he said, his voice low and steady, "but you don't talk to people like that. Not here, not anywhere." Brooks's smug expression faltered, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "You were just being disrespectful," Snoop interrupted, his tone unyielding. "This lady's out here working hard, trying to make an honest living, and you're tearing her down for what? To make yourself feel big? That's some weak energy, bro." The diners began murmuring, some nodding in agreement. A few clapped quietly, emboldened by Snoop's words. Brooks's face flushed red as he scrambled for a response. "I didn't mean anything by it. I was just joking around." "Ain't nobody laughing," Snoop said, crossing his arms. "You owe this woman an apology. Right now." Diane's heart raced as she stood frozen in place, the room spinning around her. She couldn't believe what was happening. Someone, a stranger, a celebrity no less, was standing up for her in a way no one ever had. Brooks stammered, his confidence completely shattered. "I'm sorry," he muttered, avoiding Diane's eyes. Snoop tilted his head. "Louder." Brooks glanced around the room, clearly humiliated. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice louder this time. Diane nodded, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you." The room erupted into applause, the tension finally breaking. Snoop smiled, turning to Diane. "You good?" he asked, his tone warm. "Yes," Diane said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." "Don't mention it," Snoop replied with a grin. He turned to the rest of the diner. "Let this be a lesson why all respect people. It ain't hard." The crowd cheered again, and and Snoop casually returned to his booth as if nothing had happened. Diane stood there, her tray in hand, feeling a mixture of shock, gratitude, and an overwhelming sense of relief. The diner buzzed with energy as the ripple effects of the confrontation lingered in the air. Conversations swirled around what had just happened, with several customers stealing glances at Diane, some offering small smiles or nods of support. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel invisible. But while her gratitude for Snoop Dogg's intervention was immense, Diane also felt an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, let alone in such a dramatic way. "Diane, you good?" Maria asked as she approached, her voice tinged with guilt. The manager's earlier hesitance to step in clearly weighed on her. "I'm fine," Diane said, her voice steady though her hands still shook. "I just need to keep working." Maria gave her a sympathetic nod and reached out to touch her shoulder. "You handled that better than I would have," she said softly. "If you need to step outside for a minute, let me know." Diane shook her head. "I'm okay," she replied. "Thanks, Maria." As she turned to refill drinks at table 7, Diane noticed the man of the hour, the unmistakable Snoop Dogg, still sitting in his booth. He was sipping his coffee casually, seemingly unaffected by the stir he'd caused. Diane hesitated for a moment before walking over to his table, unsure of what to say but feeling the need to express her gratitude. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her southern accent soft but clear. "I just wanted to thank you for what you did back there. You didn't have to step in, but you did, and it means a lot." Snoop looked up, a small smile playing on his lips. "Ain't nothing, darlin'," he said, waving her off gently. "You didn't deserve that. Nobody does. Sometimes people just need to be reminded how to act right." Diane chuckled nervously, shifting the coffee pot in her hand. "Well, you reminded them pretty good," she said, her smile widening. "I don't think Mr. Brooks will be back anytime soon." "Good," Snoop said with a nod. "Place like this don't need that kind of energy." He paused, studying her for a moment. "You from the South?" "Yes, sir." "Jackson, Mississippi," Diane replied, a hint of pride creeping into her tone. "Been in L.A. for about 2 years now." "Figured," Snoop said, leaning back in his seat. "That accent's got a lot of soul. Don't let nobody make you feel bad about it." Diane felt her cheeks flush. "Thank you," she said again, her voice quieter this time. "It's been hard moving here and starting fresh. People don't always get it." Snoop nodded knowingly. "Change is tough, but you're tougher. I can see it," he said. "So what's the dream? This diner your endgame, or you got something bigger cooking?" Diane blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Well, I've always wanted to open my own bakery," she admitted, her voice tinged with hesitation. "It's why I came out here. I'm saving up for it, little by little." A slow smile spread across Snoop's face. "A bakery, huh? What kind of stuff you make?" "All sorts," Diane said, her excitement bubbling to the surface despite herself. "Cakes, pies, cookies, anything sweet, really. My grandma taught me everything I know. She always said food has a way of bringing people together, and I've always loved that." Snoop nodded thoughtfully. "Your grandma sounds like a smart lady, and you sound like you got something special. Don't let it go." Before Diane could respond, a voice from across the diner called out, interrupting their conversation. "Snoop, man, is that really you?" A middle-aged man with a phone in his hand approached the table, his face lit with a mix of excitement and disbelief. Snoop gave the man a polite nod and a fist bump. "What's good, fam?" The man launched into a flurry of praise, clearly starstruck. Within moments, more diners gathered around, eager for selfies and autographs. Diane stepped back, suddenly feeling out of place amid the growing crowd. She retreated to the counter, watching as Snoop interacted effortlessly with his fans, his laid-back charm captivating everyone. "You okay?" Diane Elena asked, sliding into the space next to her. Diane nodded, her eyes still on the scene unfolding in the middle of the diner. "Yeah, just processing." Elena grinned. "Well, you're kind of famous now. You know someone's already posting that video online?" Diane groaned, the thought of her face plastered all over social media making her stomach churn. "Great," she muttered. "Just what I needed." But even as she said it, a small part of her couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. Maybe, Just maybe, today wasn't just about standing up to someone like Mr. Brooks. Maybe it was about something bigger, something she wasn't ready to believe in just yet. The diner was now a full-blown spectacle. Customers crowded around Snoop Dogg's booth, snapping selfies, laughing, and even sharing stories of how much his music had meant to them. Phones were out everywhere, and Diane could feel the energy shift. What had started as a humiliating confrontation with Mr. Brooks had transformed into an electrifying event she couldn't have imagined. From her spot near the counter, Diane watched the scene unfold, torn between awe and uncertainty. Her co-workers whispered excitedly, nudging each other as they tried to catch a glimpse of Snoop through the growing crowd. Maria, ever the opportunist, had grabbed her own phone and was recording from behind the register. As the buzz reached its peak, Snoop suddenly held up a hand, signaling for quiet. The room responded instantly, the chatter fading into a low hum. He stood up, towering over the crowd with an air of authority that silenced even the most eager fans. "Hey, listen up, everybody," he said, his smooth voice cutting through the room. "Why, all know I love the love I really do. But we gotta take a second to show some love to someone who really deserves it." The crowd shifted, their eyes following his as he pointed directly at Diane. Her heart stopped. For a moment she thought she'd misheard, but the hush in the room told her otherwise. "This lady right here," Snoop said, motioning for Diane to come forward. "Diane, right?" She hesitated, her palms damp as all eyes turned toward her. "Ah, yes, that's me," she said, her voice barely audible. "See, on up here," Diane. Snoop encouraged, his grin warm and genuine. "Don't be shy now." The crowd parted like the Red Sea, creating a path from the counter to Snoop's booth. Diane swallowed hard, clutching the edge of her apron as she willed her feet to move. Her co-workers gave her encouraging nods, and even Maria gestured for her to go. Slowly she made her way through the aisle, her steps tentative but steady. When she reached the booth, Snoop extended a hand to her. "Y'all see this lady right here," he said, addressing the crowd. "This is what hard work, grace, and dignity look like. She didn't let that fool back there," he pointed toward the now empty table where Mr. Brooks had sat, break her spirit. "That's strength. That's what we need to respect." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound echoing off the walls of the small diner. Diane stood frozen, her hand still in Snoop's as her eyes scanned the room. It felt surreal, like she'd stepped into someone else's life for a moment. "Diane," Snoop continued, his voice softer now, just for her. "I heard you got dreams. Tell these folks about it." She blinked, caught off guard. Well, she started, glancing nervously at the expectant faces around her. "I've always wanted to open my own bakery. It's something I've dreamed about since I was a little girl. My grandma taught me how to bake, and she always said it was my gift to share with the world." The room was silent, everyone hanging on her every word. Diane's voice grew steadier as she continued, "But moving here and trying to save up for it. It hasn't been easy. Sometimes it feels like it's too far out of reach." Snoop nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Well, let me tell you something, Diane. You don't give up on that dream. Not ever. You hear me?" She nodded, tears threatening to spill over. "Yes, sir." "And we ain't gonna let you give up," either, Snoop added, turning to the crowd. "How many of why all think Diane deserves a shot at making her dream come true?" The crowd erupted into cheers and whistles, some shouting affirmations like "absolutely" and "she deserves it." Snoop smiled, clearly pleased with the response. "All right then, here's what we're gonna do. Diane, you got a phone?" Yes, I do," she said, fumbling to pull it out of her apron pocket. "Good, I'm gonna hook you up with some folks I know who love supporting local talent. They run grants and mentorship programs for people just like you, people with real talent and big dreams. You down for that?" Diane's jaw dropped. "Are you serious?" "Always," Snoop said with a wink. "But that's just the start. I'm posting about you and your story tonight. We're gonna make sure the world knows about Diane and her bakery." The crowd erupted again, and Diane felt her legs go weak. She leaned against the booth for support, overwhelmed by the turn her day had taken. Just hours ago, she'd been humiliated and belittled. Now, she was standing in the middle of a diner, surrounded by strangers who believed in her, and all because one person had chosen to stand up for her. Snoop leaned in, his voice low so only she could hear. "You've got something special, Diane. Don't let nobody take that from you." "All right." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you. I don't even know how to thank you." "You just keep doing what you do," Snoop said with a grin. "That's all the thanks I need." As the crowd cheered again, Diane felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Maybe, just maybe, her dream wasn't so far out of reach after all. By the time the crowd around Snoop's booth began to thin, Diane's heart was still pounding. She stood by the counter, clutching her phone like a lifeline, her emotions a mixture of disbelief, gratitude, and cautious optimism. Her coworkers buzzed with excitement, replaying the events of the past hour. "Girl, you're going to be famous," Elena said, nudging Diane with her elbow. "Did you see how many people were recording? You'll be trending by tonight." Diane smiled faintly, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about Snoop Dogg's words and the weight of what had just happened. He hadn't just stood up for her, he'd given her something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years of belief that her dreams might actually be possible. Across the diner, Snoop was gathering his things, surrounded by a handful of lingering fans. Before leaving, he turned back to Diane, catching her eye. With a quick nod, he gestured for her to come over. She hesitated, glancing at Maria, who waved her off. "Go," Maria said with a grin. "I'll cover your tables." Diane hurried over, her apron swishing as she walked. "Yes, sir," she said softly, stopping a few feet away. "Here," Snoop said, pulling out a sleek black business card and handing it to her. "That's the contact for the program I told you about. You call them first thing tomorrow, and they'll take care of you. Tell them I sent you." Diane stared at the card, her hands trembling as she held it. "I will, thank you so much," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And don't forget to keep in touch," Snoop added, pulling out his phone. "What's your Instagram?" Diane blinked, her mind scrambling to process the question. "Oh, I don't really post much. I have one, though," she said, fumbling to open the app on her phone. Snoop chuckled. "Well, you're going to start posting now. You got to show the world what you're working on. Trust me, people love a story like yours." She handed him her phone and he quickly followed her account before handing it back. "There you go," he said. "Now you got no excuse." Diane laughed nervously, staring at her phone as if it held all the answers to her future. "I don't know how to thank you," she said again, feeling the words fall short. "Just keep pushing, Diane. That's thanks enough," Snoop said with a smile. He gave her a quick hug and turned toward the door, leaving the diner with the same effortless cool he'd brought in. The crowd watched him go, the sound of his name murmured like a ripple in the air. Diane stood frozen for a moment, the business card clutched tightly in her hand. She felt Maria's hand on her shoulder and turned to see her manager smiling warmly. "Well, I'd say that was the most exciting lunch shift we've ever had," Maria said. "How are you feeling?" "Honestly," Diane said, exhaling deeply, "I don't even know." "You should feel proud," Maria said firmly. "You handled yourself with grace, and now look what's happening. People see you, Diane. They see what you're capable of." Diane nodded, a small smile creeping onto her face. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen not for her mistakes or her struggles, but for her strength and her potential. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. Customers came up to her, some offering kind words, others asking for selfies now that they knew she'd been the waitress Snoop Dogg stood up for the sting of Mr. Brooks's words felt like a distant memory, overshadowed by the flood of positivity that filled the room. As the last table cleared out and the diner quieted down, Diane finally had a moment to herself. She sat at a booth near the back, staring at the business card in her hand. The name of the grant program gleamed in embossed gold letters, and for the first time she let herself imagine what it might feel like to walk into her very own bakery to see her name on the sign, her creations filling the display case, and customers lining up to taste the flavors of her dreams. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. A notification popped up. Snoop Dogg had posted a picture of the two of them, along with a caption that read, "Met this incredible woman today. She's got big dreams, and I know she's going to make EM happen. Why, I'll show her some love." Diane's jaw dropped as she clicked on the post. Thousands of likes and comments were pouring in, with strangers offering words of encouragement and promises to support her future bakery. She felt her chest tighten, but this time it wasn't from anxiety, it was from hope. Tears filled her eyes as she read the comments, her hand covering her mouth to stifle a sob. For the first time, she believed that maybe she wasn't just dreaming. Maybe her future was closer than she thought. The next morning, sunlight streamed through Diane's apartment window, casting a warm glow over the modest space. She sat at her tiny kitchen table, the business card Snoop Dogg had given her resting in front of her. Beside it lay her phone, which hadn't stopped buzzing with notifications since last night. The post he'd shared had gone viral, racking up hundreds of thousands of likes and shares. Her inbox was flooded with messages, encouragement, job offers, and even inquiries from people asking when her bakery would open. Diane sipped her coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she scrolled through the messages. Each one felt like a small piece of validation, a sign that maybe, just maybe, she was on the right path. But there was one thing she hadn't done yet, call the grant program. She took a deep breath, staring at the number printed on the card. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, clutching her phone as if it might slip away. With a shaky exhale, she dialed the number and pressed the phone to her ear. After a few rings, a cheerful voice answered. "Good morning. This is the Dream Builders Grant Program. How can I help you?" "Hi," Diane said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Diane Matthews, and I was told to call this number. Snoop Dogg suggested I reach out about a grant." The woman on the other end let out a small laugh. "Oh, you're the Diane he posted about. We've been expecting your call." Diane's heart skipped a beat. "You have?" "Absolutely. Mr. Broadus spoke highly of you and said you've got big plans for a bakery. We'd love to hear more about it." For the next 10 minutes, Diane poured her heart out, describing her vision for her bakery, a place that felt like home, filled with the smells of fresh bread and warm cookies, a space where people could gather and share stories over slices of pie. By the time she finished, her voice was thick with emotion, and she was certain she'd rambled too much. "That sounds incredible," Diane, the woman said warmly. "We'd love to help you bring this to life. The first step is setting up a consultation with one of our mentors. Can you come to our office tomorrow?" Diane blinked, her grip tightening on the phone. "You mean, you're really going to help me?" "Of course. We'll work with you to create a solid business plan and help secure funding through our grant program. With your passion and vision, I have no doubt you'll succeed." Tears streamed down Diane's face as she thanked the woman, her voice shaking with gratitude. When the call ended, she sat back in her chair, staring at her phone in disbelief. For the first time, her dream didn't feel like a distant fantasy. It felt real, tangible, like something she could reach out and touch. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind. Diane met with mentors, attended workshops, and began drafting her business plan. The grant program connected her with local investors, and the outpouring of support from the online community only grew. People shared her story far and wide, offering donations and pledging to visit her bakery as soon as it opened. One evening, Diane stood in what would soon become her bakery, a small storefront on a bustling street corner in Los Angeles. The space was empty except for a few paint cans and some construction tools, but to Diane, it was perfect. She ran her fingers along the counter, imagining it lined with trays of freshly baked goods, and smiled. Maria and Elena stopped by to drop off coffee and pastries. "It's really happening," Elena said, looking around the space with wide eyes. "It is," Diane said, her voice tinged with wonder. "I still can't believe it." Maria placed a hand on Diane's shoulder. "Believe it, you've earned this." They sat together on overturned crates, laughing and brainstorming ideas for the grand opening. Diane's heart felt full, the weight of her struggles slowly lifting as she looked toward the future. On opening day, the bakery was a hive of activity. The smell of cinnamon rolls and chocolate chip cookies wafted out onto the street, drawing a steady stream of customers. Friends, co-workers, and even strangers from the online community had come to celebrate. A sign hung above the door, Diane's Southern Comfort Bakery. Diane moved behind the counter, greeting customers and serving up slices of her grandmother's famous pecan pie. She wore an apron embroidered with her bakery's name and a smile that never wavered. Every time she looked around the room, she felt a surge of gratitude for everyone who had helped her get to this moment. The bell above the door jingled, and Diane looked up to see Snoop Dogg walking in, his signature swagger turning heads. The room erupted into cheers and applause as he approached the counter. "Looks like you did it," he said, leaning on the counter with a grin. "Thanks to you," Diane replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't even know how to thank you." Snoop chuckled. "You already are. This right here? This is what it's all about." He pulled out his phone, snapping a picture of the two of them in front of the bakery sign. "Let's show the world what a little faith and a lot of hard work can do," he said. Diane laughed, her heart swelling as she watched him post the picture. The caption read, "Diane's dream is now a reality. Why all better stop by and get you some of this magic." As the day wore on, Diane felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She'd faced obstacles, endured humiliation, and struggled to make ends meet, but she had never given up. And now, surrounded by the laughter and warmth of her community, she knew her grandmother would be proud. Her dream was no longer just a dream, it was her life.